In the 15th century, Europe was a continent on the cusp of monumental change, yet it remained in many ways a peripheral player on the global stage. The great centers of wealth, knowledge, and power were situated further east, in places like Ming China, the vibrant Islamic caliphates, and the bustling trade hubs of India. European kingdoms, having emerged from the long shadows of the Middle Ages, were becoming more centralized and ambitious. Monarchs sought to consolidate their power, expand their territories, and most importantly, fill their treasuries. The engine of wealth, as it had been for centuries, was trade. The demand for luxury goods from the East was insatiable among the European elite, a marker of status and a source of immense pleasure and profit. These goods were not mere trinkets. They were symbols of a sophisticated world that Europeans yearned to access directly. The allure of the East was built upon a foundation of exotic and highly prized commodities. Spices like pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon were worth more than their weight in gold, not only for their ability to preserve food and mask the taste of spoilage, but also for their use in medicine and religious ceremonies. Silk from China was another coveted item, its lustrous threads woven into the garments of royalty and aristocracy, a tangible display of immense wealth. These goods, along with perfumes, precious stones, and fine porcelain, traveled thousands of miles across land and sea to reach European markets. This long-distance trade created a complex network of merchants, financiers, and intermediaries, each taking a cut of the profits along the way, making the final cost in cities like Venice or Genoa astronomical. This lucrative trade was dominated by a few key players. The great Italian maritime republics, particularly Venice and Genoa, had established a near monopoly on the European end of the trade routes. Their galleys sailed the Mediterranean, collecting goods from ports in the Levant, such as Alexandria and Constantinople, which were the western termini of the overland and sea routes from Asia. These Italian city-states grew fabulously wealthy by controlling the flow of Eastern luxuries into the rest of Europe. Their power depended entirely on maintaining these established commercial links. For other European nations, particularly those on the Atlantic coast like Portugal and Spain, this arrangement was a source of great frustration, as they were forced to pay exorbitant prices to Italian merchants for goods that had already passed through many hands. The desire to circumvent this Italian-Arab monopoly became a powerful driving force for the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal, with its long Atlantic coastline and a strong maritime tradition honed by centuries of fishing and coastal trade, was particularly well positioned to seek an alternative. The Portuguese monarchy, under visionary leaders like Prince Henry the Navigator, began to systematically invest in naval technology and exploration. They dreamed of finding a direct sea route to the sources of the spice trade, thereby cutting out the middlemen and redirecting the immense profits into their own coffers. This ambition was not just about economics, it was also intertwined with a crusading zeal, a desire to outflank the Islamic world and forge new alliances. This potent combination of God, glory, and gold set the stage for an age of unprecedented exploration. The established system of trade between East and West, though profitable for a select few, was always precarious. It relied on a long and complex chain of political and commercial relationships stretching across continents. The primary overland route, the legendary Silk Road, was not a single road but a network of trails and caravan paths that snaked across the vast expanse of Central Asia. For centuries, goods had flowed along these routes, their passage secured by the relative stability of empires like the Mongol Empire, which had once controlled much of this territory. However, as the Mongols' power waned and the region fragmented into smaller, often warring states, the safety and reliability of the Silk Road began to decline, making the journey more dangerous and the goods even more expensive for those who dared to traverse it. A far more decisive blow to the old trade order came in 1453 with the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Mehmed II. The fall of this great Christian city the capital of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years, sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Constantinople was not just a symbol, it was a critical gateway, a linchpin in the trade network connecting the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Under Ottoman control, the city, now renamed Istanbul, did not entirely close to Christian merchants, but the new rulers imposed heavy taxes and strict regulations on the trade passing through their domain. The Ottomans, now the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, effectively held a chokehold on the traditional routes to Asia, giving them immense leverage over the European powers. The Ottoman ascendancy presented the kingdoms of Western Europe with a stark choice: either pay the exorbitant prices demanded by the Venetian and Genoese merchants, who in turn had to pay the Ottoman tariffs, or find a completely new way to reach the east. For nations like Portugal and Spain, which were geographically distant from the Mediterranean's core and already resentful of the Italian monopoly, the choice was clear. The closure of the traditional land routes provided the ultimate impetus to double down on their maritime ambitions. The problem was no longer just about profit margins, it had become a matter of strategic necessity. Finding a new sea route was now the single most important geopolitical and economic objective for these burgeoning Atlantic powers. This challenge spurred a golden age of innovation in shipbuilding and navigation. European shipwrights developed the caravel, a small, highly maneuverable sailing ship that could sail effectively against the wind, making it ideal for long-distance ocean voyages. Navigators improved their use of instruments like the astrolabe and the quadrant, allowing them to determine their latitude with greater accuracy. They also began creating more detailed nautical charts, or portolans, which mapped coastlines, currents, and prevailing winds. The Portuguese, in particular, led this charge, methodically exploring the coast of Africa, pushing further south with each expedition. Their ultimate goal was to round the southern tip of Africa and sail directly across the Indian Ocean to the Spice Islands, a feat they would eventually achieve, but not before an Italian navigator with a different idea changed the world forever. While the Portuguese were meticulously charting a path around Africa, a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus proposed a radically different and far more audacious plan. Columbus believed the world was significantly smaller than most geographers of his time thought. Based on his reading of ancient texts and his own calculations, he argued that one could reach the East Indies, the source of the coveted spices, by sailing directly west across the Atlantic Ocean. He estimated the journey would be relatively short, perhaps only a few weeks. It was a daring and, as it turned out, fundamentally flawed theory, but it was presented with an unshakable conviction that captivated some and invited ridicule from others. Columbus was a man possessed by his idea, a visionary who saw a direct path to Asia where others saw only an endless empty ocean. Columbus first presented his enterprise of the Indies to King John II of Portugal around 1485. The Portuguese court, home to the most advanced nautical experts in Europe, gave his proposal serious consideration. However, their scholars correctly identified the fatal flaws in Columbus's geography. They knew the Earth was much larger than he claimed and that Asia was much farther away. They believed his proposed voyage was impossible, as his ships would run out of food and water long before reaching their destination. Having already invested heavily in the slow but steady route around Africa, which was beginning to show promise, the Portuguese king rejected Columbus's plan. Undeterred by this rejection, Columbus took his proposal elsewhere, eventually turning his attention to Portugal's great rival, Spain. In Spain, Columbus found a more receptive audience, though his success was far from immediate. He spent years lobbying the Spanish monarchs, Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon. Engaged in the final stages of the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to drive the Muslim Moors from the Iberian Peninsula, the Spanish crown had little time or money for speculative ventures. However, in 1492, With the fall of Granada, the last Moorish kingdom, Spain was unified, victorious, and eager to claim its place on the world stage. Isabella, in particular, was intrigued by Columbus's vision. The prospect of beating Portugal to the riches of the Indies, spreading Christianity to new lands, and gaining a massive strategic advantage was too tempting to ignore. They agreed to finance his voyage, granting him the titles of Admiral, Viceroy, and Governor of all the lands he might discover. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera with 3 small ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After a stop in the Canary Islands, he plunged into the unknown expanse of the Atlantic. The voyage was fraught with tension as the weeks wore on and no land appeared. His crew grew restless and fearful, but Columbus, through a combination of iron will and doctored logbooks that understated the distance they had traveled, managed to maintain control. Finally, on October 12, 1492, a lookout spotted land. Columbus had reached an island in the Bahamas, which he named San Salvador. He was convinced he had found the outskirts of Asia. The encounter with the native Taíno people, his search for gold, and his eventual return to Spain, with a few indigenous captives and exotic trinkets, sparked a frenzy of excitement and set in motion a chain of events that would irrevocably alter the course of human history. The news of Columbus's return and his claims of having reached the Indies sent shockwaves across Europe, nowhere more so than in Portugal. King John II was alarmed. He believed that the lands Columbus had found might fall within the sphere of influence granted to Portugal by previous papal bulls, which had given them rights to lands south of the Canary Islands. The Portuguese had spent decades and vast resources pioneering the African route, and they were not about to let their Spanish rivals reap the rewards of a shortcut, especially one they had previously dismissed. A major conflict between the two Iberian powers seemed imminent, as both laid claim to the potential riches of the newly discovered territories. The stakes were incredibly high, involving not just future wealth, but also national pride and geopolitical dominance. To avert a war, Spain and Portugal turned to the one authority they both recognized as a supreme arbiter, the Pope. At the time, the papacy held immense political and spiritual power, and its decrees could legitimize a monarch's claims in the eyes of the Christian world. Pope Alexander VI, who happened to be Spanish by birth, was called upon to mediate the dispute. In 1493, he issued a series of papal bulls, most notably Inter Caetera. This decree established a line of demarcation running from north to south, 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. It granted Spain the exclusive right to explore and claim all lands to the west of this line, while Portugal was granted the lands to the east. This was a monumental decision, an attempt to partition the entire non-Christian world between two kingdoms. The Portuguese, however, were not satisfied with this arrangement. They argued that the Pope's line was too far east, which would severely limit their ability to navigate the African coast and could potentially exclude them from any lands yet to be discovered in the South Atlantic. They entered into direct negotiations with Spain to modify the papal decree. This diplomatic effort culminated in the signing of the Treaty of Tordesillas on June 7, 1494. The treaty moved the line of demarcation 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. This seemingly minor adjustment would have enormous consequences. While neither nation knew it at the time, the new line cut through the eastern part of the South American continent. This shift was a diplomatic victory for Portugal. While Spain gained control over the vast majority of the Americas, a continent whose true scale was still completely unknown, the new line ensured that the easternmost tip of South America fell into the Portuguese zone. This is precisely why, years later, when Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral was blown off course on his way to India in 1500, his accidental landing on the coast of what is now Brazil was claimed legally and without dispute for the Portuguese crown. The Treaty of Tordesillas was a remarkable act of European arrogance and ambition, an agreement between two small nations to divide a world whose inhabitants had no say in the matter. It laid the foundation for the distinct colonial empires that would develop in the Americas. Following Columbus's first voyage, Spanish colonization began in earnest on the island he named Hispaniola, which is today shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. On his second voyage in 1493, Columbus returned not with 3 small ships, but with a grand fleet of 17 vessels, carrying over 1,200 men, soldiers, farmers, artisans, and priests. Their mission was no longer just exploration, it was settlement and exploitation. They established the colony of La Isabela, the first permanent European settlement in the Americas. The primary motivation for the Spanish crown and the colonists themselves was the acquisition of wealth, specifically gold. Columbus had seen the native Taino people wearing small gold ornaments, and he became obsessed with finding the source of this precious metal. The early years on Hispaniola were brutal and chaotic. The Spanish colonists, driven by a feverish lust for gold, imposed a system of forced labor on the Taino population. Under the encomienda system, Spanish settlers were granted land and the right to demand tribute and labor from the native inhabitants. In practice, this was a system of thinly veiled slavery. The Taino were forced to mine for gold and work on plantations under horrific conditions. Those who resisted were met with extreme violence. The combination of overwork, malnutrition, and violence took a devastating toll. However, an even deadlier force was at work. European diseases, such as smallpox and measles, to which the indigenous population had no immunity, swept through the island, leading to a catastrophic demographic collapse. Hispaniola became a grim laboratory for Spanish colonial methods. Meanwhile, Portugal's focus remained primarily on its lucrative trade empire in Africa and Asia. Their claim to Brazil, secured by the Treaty of Tordesillas and confirmed by Cabral's landing in 1500, was initially a low priority. For the first few decades, Portuguese activity in Brazil was limited. The Crown established a few coastal trading posts, known as feitorias, to harvest Brazil wood, a valuable timber that produced a red dye highly sought after in Europe. This gave the land its name. Unlike the Spanish in Hispaniola, the Portuguese did not immediately find vast deposits of gold or silver, so there was less incentive for large-scale settlement. Their interactions with the indigenous Tupi people were initially based on trade, with natives cutting and logging the Brazil wood in exchange for European goods like metal tools and cloth. This relatively hands-off approach changed around the 1530s. The threat of French incursions along the Brazilian coast, coupled with declining profits from the Asian spice trade, prompted the Portuguese crown to take a more active role in securing its American territory. King John III implemented the system of captaincy grants, dividing the coastline into 15 large strips of land which were granted to wealthy Portuguese nobles or donatarios. These captains were responsible for financing the colonization and development of their territories, including establishing settlements and setting up agriculture. This system had mixed results, but it did lead to the founding of permanent towns like São Vicente and Olinda, and most importantly, the introduction of sugarcane cultivation, which would soon transform Brazil into the world's leading sugar producer and create a new, brutal demand for labor. After establishing their initial colonies in the Caribbean, the Spanish began to hear persistent rumors of powerful, wealthy empires located on the mainland. The small amounts of gold found on islands like Hispaniola and Cuba only whetted their appetite for greater riches. These rumors pointed them westward, toward what is now Mexico. In 1519, a determined and ruthless conquistador named Hernán Cortés led an expedition of just 600 men from Cuba to the mainland. His target was the mighty Aztec Empire, a sophisticated and complex society that ruled over millions of people from its magnificent capital city, Tenochtitlan, located on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. The city, with its towering pyramids, vast marketplaces, and intricate canal systems, was larger and more impressive than any city in Spain at the time. The Aztec emperor, Moctezuma II, initially received the Spanish with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Aztec mythology contained prophecies about the return of a light-skinned, bearded god, Quetzalcoatl, from the east, and some wondered if Cortés could be this returning deity. Cortés skillfully exploited this uncertainty, presenting himself as an emissary of a powerful king from across the sea. He formed crucial alliances with various indigenous groups who had been conquered by the Aztecs and deeply resented their rule and the heavy tribute they were forced to pay, including the demand for human sacrifices. These native allies provided Cortés with thousands of warriors, logistical support, and vital intelligence, transforming his small band of Spaniards into a formidable invading army. The conquest of the Aztecs was not just a Spanish victory. It was a civil war within the empire, which Cortés masterfully manipulated. A similar story of ambition, intrigue, and conquest unfolded a decade later in South America. Lured by tales of an even wealthier empire, overflowing with gold and silver in the Andes Mountains, another Spanish conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, mounted an expedition to Peru. In 1532, with a tiny force of fewer than 200 men, he came face to face with the Inca Empire. The Inca ruled a vast, highly organized territory stretching for thousands of miles along the Andes, connected by an impressive network of roads. However, when Pizarro arrived, the empire was severely weakened. It had just emerged from a bloody civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, who were fighting for control of the throne. Atahualpa had just defeated his brother, but the empire was fractured and politically unstable. Pizarro, like Cortés, took full advantage of the internal divisions. He arranged a meeting with the victorious emperor Atahualpa in the city of Cajamarca. In a stunningly audacious move, Pizarro's men ambushed Atahualpa's retinue, capturing the emperor and slaughtering thousands of his lightly armed followers in a matter of hours. With the emperor, who was considered a living god, held hostage, the Inca chain of command was paralyzed. Atahualpa offered to fill a large room once with gold and twice with silver as a ransom for his freedom. The Spanish agreed, and for months precious artifacts poured into Cajamarca from all corners of the empire. After the ransom was paid, Pizarro, fearing an Inca rebellion, executed Atahualpa anyway. This act of treachery decapitated the empire, making it far easier for the Spanish to conquer the rest of its territory piece by piece. How could such small bands of Spanish conquistadors, numbering only in the hundreds, topple mighty empires with populations in the millions? The answer lies in a combination of factors, but none were more decisive than the technological and biological advantages the Europeans possessed. The Spanish fought with weapons forged from steel, including swords, pikes, and armor. This gave them a tremendous advantage over Aztec and Inca warriors, whose primary weapons were made of wood, stone, and obsidian. A steel sword could easily cut through the padded cotton armor worn by native soldiers, while their obsidian-bladed clubs, though razor-sharp, would shatter against Spanish steel helmets and breastplates. This disparity in military metallurgy meant that in close quarters combat, a single Spaniard could often hold his own against multiple opponents. Furthermore, the Spanish brought with them tools of war that were completely alien to the Americas. They had firearms, including harquebuses, early muskets, and cannons. While these early guns were slow to load, inaccurate, and unreliable, their psychological impact was immense. The deafening roar, the flash of fire, and the clouds of smoke terrified native warriors who had never witnessed such technology. Even more effective were the horses. The Spanish cavalry provided a massive advantage in shock tactics and mobility. The sight of a man on horseback, clad in shimmering armor and charging at full gallop, was terrifying, and appeared to be a single monstrous creature. Horses allowed the Spanish to outmaneuver native armies launched devastating charges that could break enemy formations and pursue fleeing soldiers with lethal efficiency. However, the most powerful and devastating weapon the Europeans brought to the Americas was entirely unintentional and invisible. For millennia, Europeans had lived in close proximity to domesticated animals like cattle, pigs, and sheep. This constant exposure had allowed them to develop immunities to a host of diseases that originated in these animals, such as smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus. The peoples of the Americas, having domesticated far fewer animals, had never been exposed to these pathogens and therefore had no acquired immunity. When the Europeans arrived, they unleashed what has been termed a virgin soil epidemic. These diseases swept through the indigenous populations with terrifying speed and lethality, often spreading far ahead of the conquistadors themselves. These epidemics caused a demographic catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Smallpox, in particular, ravaged the Aztec Empire during the siege of Tenochtitlan, killing a huge portion of the population, including the successor to Moctezuma, and severely weakening the defenders. Similarly, the Inca Empire was likely hit by a smallpox epidemic even before Pizarro's arrival, contributing to the civil war that he so expertly exploited. Some historians estimate that up to 90% of the native population of the Americas died from European diseases within a century of contact. This great dying not only killed millions, but also shattered the social, political, and religious fabric of native societies, leaving them demoralized and unable to mount effective resistance. The germs, far more than the guns or steel, were the true conquerors of the Americas. The European colonization of the Americas, initiated by Columbus's voyages and solidified by the conquests of Cortés and Pizarro, fundamentally and irrevocably reshaped the world. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the consequences were catastrophic. Their populations were decimated by disease, warfare, and brutal exploitation. Their empires were dismantled, their cities destroyed, and their lands confiscated. They were forced into systems of labor like the encomienda and later debt peonage to work in mines and on plantations for the benefit of their European masters. Their religious beliefs were suppressed, their temples razed, and they were subjected to forceful conversion to Christianity. The rich and diverse tapestry of cultures that had developed over millennia was torn apart, with countless languages, traditions, and histories lost forever. For Europe, the colonization of the Americas ushered in an era of unprecedented wealth and power. The vast quantities of silver and gold extracted from the mines of Mexico and Peru flooded into Spain, financing its armies and its ambitions to become the dominant power in Europe. This influx of precious metals, however, also led to massive inflation across the continent. More importantly, colonization sparked the Columbian Exchange, the widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, technology, and ideas between the Americas and the Old World. Europe received new staple crops like potatoes, maize, and tomatoes, which revolutionized agriculture and diets, helping to fuel a population boom. Other products like tobacco, vanilla, and chocolate became highly sought-after commodities, creating new markets and new sources of wealth. The Columbian Exchange flowed in both directions. The Americas were transformed by the introduction of European livestock, such as horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep, which altered landscapes and native ways of life. European crops like wheat, barley, and sugarcane were introduced, with sugarcane in particular creating the vast plantation economies of Brazil and the Caribbean. This plantation system, driven by an insatiable European demand for sugar, led to one of the most horrific chapters in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. When disease wiped out the native labor force, European colonists turned to Africa, forcibly transporting millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas to toil in brutal conditions. This created new racially stratified societies and a legacy of systemic inequality that endures to this day. In the long run, the colonization of the Americas shifted the center of global power. It marked the beginning of European global dominance that would last for centuries. The wealth extracted from the Americas fueled the rise of capitalism, spurred the Industrial Revolution, and financed the expansion of European empires across the globe. The encounter between these two previously separate worlds created a new, interconnected Atlantic world, but it was a world built on a foundation of conquest, exploitation, and profound human suffering. The epic tale of European colonization is not simply a story of discovery and adventure. It is a complex and often tragic history whose consequences continue to shape the economic, political, and social realities of our modern world on both sides of the Atlantic.